She endured years of torment, nights filled with fear, and days spent walking on eggshells. But on this particular evening, the cycle of abuse would come to an explosive end. As the world slept, one woman decided she could no longer endure the pain. With a single act, fueled by desperation and a sense of no escape, she changed not only her life, but ignited a fire that would transform how America viewed domestic violence forever. Was this an act of justice or desperation? Today, we uncover the truth. Welcome to CrimeByte, where we uncover the shocking truths behind the world's most compelling cases. I'm your host, and tonight we bring you the haunting story of a wife whose fight for freedom ended in an act of fire that stunned a nation. Together, we'll explore the moments that led to her decision, the courtroom battle that followed, and the lasting impact on how we understand abuse today. Stay with us as we unravel this unforgettable story, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and click the notification bell to join us on more journeys into the darker sides of human nature. Francine Hughes was, by all accounts, a bright and hopeful young woman. Growing up in a modest home, she dreamed of becoming a nurse and building a stable, happy life. Friends described her as kind-hearted, with a gentle smile and an infectious laugh. Her mother would often find her sketching plans for her future, imagining a life where she could provide care and comfort to those in need. But dreams can sometimes lead us into unexpected places. At just 16, Francine met James "Mickey" Hughes, a man several years her senior. Initially, Mickey seemed charming and attentive. Friends remember him as a confident figure with an edge of authority, qualities that drew Francine in. He could be so sweet, one friend recalled. You'd never guess what he was capable of. Within a year, the two were married, and Francine's future seemed set. What began as a seemingly stable union quickly turned sour. Mickey's temper surfaced in small, cutting remarks, which soon escalated to controlling behaviors. Francine confided in a friend about Mickey's possessiveness, but she brushed it off, hoping things would improve once they settled into married life. Society in the 1970s often encouraged women to endure challenges in marriage rather than leave. And Francine's upbringing taught her to prioritize family stability over personal happiness. The pressures of raising children only intensified Mickey's outbursts. Small disagreements spiraled into violent confrontations. Francine's world, once full of promise, now revolved around survival. She was always so quiet when we saw her, a neighbor recalled, like she was afraid to say the wrong thing. As Mickey's abuse worsened, Francine's hope for escape grew faint. Family and friends were limited in their understanding of domestic violence, often advising her to keep the peace. Little did they know that Francine's struggle would soon lead to a turning point that would change everything, not only for her, but for the country as a whole. How did a bright young woman, full of dreams, find herself trapped in a nightmare she never saw coming? At first, Mickey's anger revealed itself in small ways. A harsh word, a slammed door, an icy glare that chilled Francine to the bone. But these moments quickly became more frequent and more dangerous. Friends and neighbors began noticing unexplained bruises on Francine's arms and a noticeable shift in her demeanor. Once outgoing, she now avoided eye contact and rarely left the house without Mickey. Francine endured years of physical and emotional torment. Mickey controlled every aspect of her life, from who she spoke to how she spent money. His temper was volatile, and even the smallest perceived slight could ignite his rage. He had this way of making you feel trapped, Francine later recounted, like there was no way out. As her children grew older, Francine worried not only for herself, but for their safety. Mickey's outbursts didn't stop at her. They spilled over into the lives of their kids, leaving a lasting imprint on the entire household. Despite the fear and pain, Francine felt paralyzed. At the time, societal attitudes toward domestic violence left little room for escape. Divorce was stigmatized, and law enforcement often treated abuse as a private matter, offering little help. Francine's world became one of silent suffering, hidden from view by the walls of her home. Those walls, however, would not be able to contain the explosive consequences of Mickey's reign of terror. As the abuse escalated, Francine's desperation grew, a quiet storm building to an unthinkable act that would change the lives of everyone involved. What happens when the walls meant to protect a family become the very barriers that imprison them? Francine's cries for help were silent, muffled by societal norms that discouraged women from speaking out against their husbands. In her community, divorce was seen as shameful, and law enforcement was hesitant to interfere in what they labeled domestic disputes. Neighbors occasionally heard shouting from the Hughes home, but no one wanted to get involved. "It wasn't our place," one neighbor admitted years later. "Back then, you just assumed things would work themselves out." Francine's family expressed concern, but they too felt powerless. Her mother urged her to stay for the sake of the children, while her friends advised her to keep the peace. Each piece of advice, though well-intentioned, reinforced Francine's growing sense of isolation. She began to feel as though she was truly trapped, with no allies and no escape. Mickey's grip tightened. He frequently destroyed household items in fits of rage, tore up Francine's clothing, and threatened her with further violence if she ever thought of leaving. Yet, despite the obvious signs of abuse, society's indifference allowed him to continue unchecked. Francine later described feeling as though her life had become invisible. "No one could see me. No one wanted to." Francine's children, growing up under the shadow of Mickey's abuse, bore silent witness to their mother's suffering. They later described how Mickey's unpredictable rage filled every corner of their home, leaving them in constant fear. Despite the love Francine poured into them, she couldn't shield them from the reality of their father's violence. With each passing year, Francine's world grew smaller. Her sense of hope dimmed, and her ability to envision a life beyond Mickey's control faded. Yet deep within her, a quiet resolve began to form. A resolve that would erupt into action on one fateful night. Could someone have intervened before it was too late, or did societal norms make silence the only option? March 9, 1977 began like many other days for Francine, marked by fear and exhaustion. Mickey's temper had been especially volatile in recent weeks, with arguments escalating into violent outbursts. That evening, after an explosive confrontation, Mickey demanded dinner and berated Francine for perceived slights. He smashed plates, tore through her belongings, and reminded her that she would never leave him alive. For Francine, something shifted. She later described a moment of clarity. "I knew, if I didn't do something, he'd kill me." After Mickey fell asleep in a drunken stupor, Francine stood in the kitchen, paralyzed by indecision. But years of pent-up fear and desperation overwhelmed her. She gathered her children, telling them to wait in the car. Then, with tears streaming down her face, she returned to the bedroom, where Mickey lay snoring. In one final act of defiance, she poured gasoline around the bed and struck a match. Flames engulfed the room almost instantly. Francine drove straight to the police station, shaking uncontrollably as she confessed to what she had done. Officers described her as disheveled and distraught, repeatedly stating, "I didn't have a choice." Back at the house, firefighters worked to extinguish the flames, only to discover Mickey's remains among the ashes. The community was stunned. How could such a seemingly ordinary wife and mother commit such an act? What pushes a person from enduring fear to committing an act of unimaginable consequence? Francine's arrest marked the beginning of a case that would captivate the nation, forcing Americans to confront the dark reality of domestic violence and the lengths to which victims might go to escape it. News of Francine's arrest sent shockwaves through the small Michigan town. The idea that a quiet, unassuming mother could set fire to her husband while he slept stunned everyone who knew her. "She was always so polite," one neighbor said. "You'd never think she was capable of something like this." But those closest to Francine weren't as surprised. To them, her actions were not born of malice, but desperation. A last-ditch effort to save herself and her children from years of torment. At the police station, Francine gave a full confession. She detailed the years of abuse she'd suffered, recounting how Mickey's violent outbursts left her in constant fear for her life. "He told me he'd kill me if I ever tried to leave," she told officers. Her words painted a chilling picture of a woman trapped in a nightmare with no visible escape. Still, the law was clear. Francine had taken a life, and she would be charged with murder. As news spread, the public reaction was polarizing. Some viewed Francine as a cold-blooded killer, someone who took justice into her own hands rather than seeking help. Others saw her as a victim, a woman pushed to the brink by a system that had failed to protect her. Local media outlets picked up the story, turning it into a sensation. Headlines like "Wife confesses to burning husband alive" and mother or murderer dominated the news cycle, fueling debates around the ethics of her actions. Inside her holding cell, Francine grappled with what lay ahead. She had acted to save herself, but would a court see it that way? Her children, now staying with relatives, became her primary concern. All I wanted was to keep them safe, she later said. But the wheels of justice had already begun turning, and Francine's case was about to become a flashpoint in America's understanding of domestic violence. Is it possible to judge an act of desperation without fully understanding the life that led to it? Francine's trial began under intense national scrutiny. Prosecutors painted her as a cold and calculated murderer, someone who chose arson as her weapon and executed her plan with precision. They argued that she had ample opportunity to leave Mickey, and that her decision to stay undermined any claims of self-defense. This was not an act of survival, the prosecutor stated during opening arguments. This was revenge. The defense, however, presented a starkly different narrative. They introduced the concept of battered woman syndrome, a term largely unfamiliar to the public at the time. Expert witnesses explained how years of abuse can leave victims feeling hopeless and trapped, unable to see traditional escape routes as viable options. Francine's attorney argued that her actions were the result of prolonged psychological trauma, a desperate act by a woman who saw no other way out. Testimonies from Francine's friends and family painted a vivid picture of the horrors she endured. They described Mickey's violent temper, his control over every aspect of her life, and his repeated threats to kill her if she ever tried to leave. She was living in constant fear, one friend testified. She thought this was the only way to protect herself and her kids. The trial became a battleground for larger societal issues. Activists rallied outside the courthouse, demanding better protections for domestic abuse victims and recognition of the psychological toll of prolonged violence. Meanwhile, critics of the defense accused it of justifying murder and setting a dangerous precedent. The jury, caught between these opposing forces, faced an agonizing decision. As the trial drew to a close, one question remained. Would the jury view Francine's actions as an unforgivable crime or a tragic consequence of a life lived in terror? After weeks of emotional testimony and fierce arguments, the jury finally reached a decision. Francine Hughes sat silently at the defense table, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The courtroom felt electric, the air thick with anticipation. When the foreperson rose and delivered the verdict, not guilty by reason of temporary insanity, a wave of shock rippled through the gallery. The decision was groundbreaking, signaling a shift in how courts viewed victims of domestic violence. For the first time, the legal system acknowledged the psychological toll of prolonged abuse as a factor in criminal behavior. Francine's case became a national flashpoint, sparking heated discussions about the justice system's role in protecting victims and the limitations survivors faced when trying to escape dangerous situations. Outside the courthouse, advocates for domestic violence victims celebrated the verdict as a hard-won victory. This isn't just about Francine, one activist proclaimed. This is about every woman who has ever been told to endure abuse because no one would believe her. Meanwhile, critics of the ruling argued it set a dangerous precedent, fearing it could excuse premeditated acts of violence under the guise of psychological trauma. For Francine, the verdict was both a relief and a burden. She was free from legal punishment, but her life would never return to what it had been. Her children, though safe from Mickey's wrath, carried scars of their own. Yet, amidst the chaos, her case paved the way for a broader conversation, a conversation that would ultimately lead to stronger protections for victims of domestic violence. As the public grappled with the verdict's significance, one question remained. Could this case truly change the way America handles domestic violence, or would it fade into history as a singular moment of exception? Francine's case didn't just impact her own life. It became a turning point in how society understood and addressed domestic violence. Across the country, her story inspired survivors to come forward, sharing experiences they had previously kept hidden. Support groups swelled with new members, and hotlines reported a surge in calls from individuals seeking help. For many, Francine's courage symbolized the possibility of freedom, even in the face of overwhelming odds. The case also influenced the legal landscape. States began reevaluating their approaches to domestic violence, implementing policies that prioritized victim safety and held abusers accountable. Shelters expanded, counseling programs grew, and the term battered woman syndrome entered mainstream legal and psychological discourse. Francine's case wasn't just a story of survival, it was a catalyst for systemic change. But progress wasn't without resistance. Critics argued that the ruling blurred the lines of justice, allowing emotions to override facts. They claimed it set a precedent that could be exploited in future cases, though advocates pushed back, asserting that every case required careful evaluation of its unique circumstances. Francine's children, now adults, spoke candidly about their mother's ordeal. They described the years of fear they endured and the complex emotions they felt about her decision. "We lost a father," one said, "but we also got our lives back." Their reflections underscored the tangled web of trauma that domestic violence leaves behind, even after the abuse ends. In the shadows of Francine's case lay a powerful lesson. Abuse thrives in silence, but the courage to speak out, no matter how imperfectly, can spark change. Francine Hughes' case left an indelible mark on society. Across the United States, lawmakers, advocates, and ordinary citizens began reevaluating how domestic violence was addressed. For many, her story was a wake-up call, a stark reminder that abuse wasn't confined to sensational headlines, but was a pervasive issue affecting countless homes. In the years following her trial, advocacy groups pushed for reforms that gave victims more avenues to seek help. Shelters for battered women expanded, and hotlines became a lifeline for those in danger. The legal system began incorporating the concept of battered woman syndrome into court proceedings, offering a framework to understand the psychological toll of prolonged abuse. For the first time, victims had a language to describe their experiences and a chance to defend themselves when their actions were shaped by years of trauma. Despite these strides, the road to progress was fraught with challenges. Critics continued to argue that recognizing battered woman syndrome risked excusing criminal behavior, while others dismissed domestic violence as a private matter. Francine's case, while groundbreaking, was not a cure-all. Many victims still faced immense barriers to leaving their abusers or being believed by law enforcement and the courts. Francine herself receded from the public eye, choosing a quiet life with her children. She rarely spoke publicly about her ordeal, but when she did, her words carried a powerful message. "I didn't want to hurt anyone. I just wanted to survive." Her humility and candor resonated with survivors who saw their own struggles reflected in her story. As the decades passed, Francine's case became a symbol of resilience and a catalyst for change. It sparked conversations that hadn't existed before and encouraged people to confront uncomfortable truths about abuse. Yet the most enduring lesson was this: behind every headline lies a story of pain, courage, and the urgent need for compassion. Francine Hughes' story is not just about one woman's fight for survival. It's a story that forever altered the way society views domestic violence. Her case forced the nation to confront the grim realities of abuse and the systemic failures that often leave victims without hope. But it also showed the power of resilience, the ability of one person to spark change even in the face of unimaginable adversity. Today, her legacy lives on in the shelters that provide refuge, the hotlines that offer a lifeline, and the legal defenses that give voice to those who've been silenced. Her story reminds us that behind every closed door could lie a battle unseen, a cry for help unheard. It challenges us to be more vigilant, more compassionate, and more willing to stand up for those who can't stand up for themselves. At CrimeByte, we believe stories like Francine's are more than just cautionary tales. They are calls to action. They compel us to ask hard questions about how we protect the vulnerable and what we can do to prevent tragedies like this from happening again. Francine's bravery in her darkest hour ignited a fire that reached far beyond her small town, lighting the way for change. Thank you for watching this episode of CrimeByte. If Francine's story moved you, please like, subscribe, and click the notification bell to join us as we continue exploring the untold truths behind the world's most compelling cases. Together, we can shed light on the darkness and fight for justice where it's needed most.